When Drew Durnall published his video, creating one country to battle 184,000 other countries in the world, he introduced his audience to the game of nation states, a text-based roleplay that allowed players to create their own nations. What followed could be surmised from the title of his follow-up video, I broke a game by getting 30,000 plus players to join at the same time, an event the nation-states community would later call the Drupocalypse. A frantic scramble ensued as player-run virtual governments, known as regions, tried to recruit as many of these new coming players as they possibly could. When I published my documentary on virtual democracies 5 years later, I didn't expect it would get over 200,000 views in just 24 hours. And what followed was... well, that's the whole point of this video, right? In my documentary, I described the phenomenon of players creating democracy experiments in a variety of platforms like Reddit, Discord, and Minecraft in an attempt to govern themselves. Many of these experiments often started the same, with constitutions being drafted, with officials getting elected, and with laws being passed. Over time, these experiments diverged in wildly different ways as they grew in different directions. State-affiliated historians have infodumped long chronologies of their Discord republic's several-year history, filled with national trauma of coups d'etats, civil wars, and nuclear bombings. Capitalist economies have emerged, decked out with private equity firms, accountancy services, and financial crises, plural, that wiped out hundreds of thousands of US dollars worth of virtual currency. Entire TV networks have been set up, fancy graphics and all, to cater to a very specific linguistic minority of a Minecraft server, providing thrilling, on-the-ground coverage of a server's presidential election, from reporting live outside polling stations.
咁大家可以見到呢度附近完全一個人影都冇嘅。咁除咗上面啦，上面你可以見到阿 Muffin 喺上面啦。
To observing the manual count of ballots in a dingy basement.
好，Ken 居567佢企咗起身，咁應該就係佢個咩票點晒啦。好，咁點晒票呢，咁就會擺落呢個 Final Count 呢一個儲物箱，咁之後就代表下面個儲物箱嘅票數呢，就係最終嘅票數嚟噶啦。好，阿 Ken 俾咗張選票俾阿 Muffin 去做複核，咁我諗好快就可以出到結果啦。
To finally announcing the results of the presidential election at 3 AM local time.
哈倫已經決定咗邊一個會係下一任嘅總統。Okay, get your calculators. But only two votes one candidate managed to secure the win. Truman, sponsored by the HPP, has received 進步黨候選人 Truman 總共獲得票數係16 votes, making it Adam L.Y. Harlem's next president.
There was one key difference between Drew Durnall's video and my one though. Drew Durnall focused on the game of nation-states as a whole, host to tens of thousands of virtual governments. What this meant was that the effects of the Drupocalypse were dispersed between the various regions, with many virtual governments getting at least a slice of the pie. The same wasn't true for my video. By attempting to describe a whole genre of virtual democracies that spanned multiple games and social platforms, I focused on a very narrow selection of case studies to illustrate my points. So, instead of exposing my audience to a game with thousands of virtual governments, I exposed my audience to a single subreddit, a couple of Discord servers, and one Minecraft server. And things went sideways almost immediately. In Democracycraft, Minecraft servers began to crash. In Voices of Democracy, immigration checkpoints became overwhelmed. In Krameria, surges of absolutely no one were reported. Yeah, they got the short end of the stick for that one. It soon became apparent, however, that the impact of the video was much broader than that. As viewers flooded my inbox of stories of their virtual democracies, it became evident that players were going around creating their own experiments after being inspired by my video. Without intending to, I inadvertently started a virtual democratic revolution. The place that felt the biggest impact though was r/SimDemocracy. As the very first case study I featured in the video, the subreddit quickly became a magnet for viewers who watched the first few vidits of my video, went, "Wow, this sounds so cool, I want in," and then didn't bother watching the rest of my video. Just 13 hours after publication, the president of SimDemocracy declared a national state of emergency, having received alerts from Discord of unusual join activity on the official Discord server. The server would grow by nearly 1,000 members in just 2 weeks. New users who joined the server began asking the same question: how do I create my own political party? And soon, the pre-existing political parties were joined by swathes of new political parties, including but not limited to the Immigrant Party, the Egalitarian Party, the Syndicalist Party, the People's Party, the New People's Party, the Citizens Progress Party, the Centre, the Elf Party, People Before Clankers, the Free Pony Party, the Ultra-Capitalist Businessman Party, the Croatian Minority Party. The list goes on and on. And these parties immediately began hitting the campaign trail. The Liberal Tories party, for instance, drafted a compelling party manifesto, which read, "Please, I am new at SimDem and even on Reddit, so I don't know how to use it, but I want to engage in, so please somebody tell me how can I do the stuff that everybody does here. Also, this is a Liberal party who supports the president in liberal ways, thank you." Political parties weren't the only things to be set up by new players. One particularly keen user, MBH292, set up a newspaper called the SimDem Observer at 12:41 on the 2nd of January 2025, just 9 hours after he joined the Discord server. Minus 4 minutes later, the Observer published its first ever article, which perhaps revealed it had a slight editorial bent. A surge of new parties raises questions about trust in leadership. As SimDemocracy prepares for its first active elections in years, new political parties are sparking excitement and concern. While this signals growing political engagement, it also reveals distrust in current leadership, worsened by recent rulings. The Chief Justice ruled that several new political parties don't meet constitutional requirements, preventing them from competing in the elections. This has frustrated many who view the ruling as an attempt by the establishment to hold onto power. Support is growing for constitutionalist parties pushing for significant changes. These parties are gaining momentum, challenging the status quo and leaving established leaders uneasy about the future. The SimDem Observer actually published several articles that day. Its election correspondent, Ching, who had been in SimDemocracy for 3.5 hours, published a piece on the importance of the upcoming Senate elections. 4 hours after the paper's launch, MBH published his bombshell piece, Voter Registration Delays, the 48-hour promise broken. For months, officials claimed there were no delays in voter registration, dismissing concerns as sensationalism and asking, has anyone been waiting more than 48 hours yet? Now we have proof. A voter waited 3 months for their registration to be processed. The voter in question did file an application on the 1st of October 2024, according to government records. Slimmy was, in fact, registered to vote, but due to a clerical error by the Department of Voter Registration, wasn't notified of this. He was subsequently compensated by the department with the server's virtual currency. This case directly disproves claims from officials like, there's not any issue here really. Despite promises of 48-hour service, this voter's experience shows significant delays in the system. Delays like this risk leaving voters unregistered when it matters most. the SimDem Observer will continue investigating to hold officials accountable and ensure these failures are addressed. The promise was simple: register voters in 48 hours. It's time to deliver on that. MBH 292, the SimDem Observer, the voice of observation, not opinion. The story was published at a time when several new players were complaining about voter registration delays. But these delays weren't caused by any government conspiracy. They were caused by a massive surge in voter registration applications. On the 2nd of January 2025, the Department of Voter Registration received an application every 12 minutes. And it wasn't like the department could rubber stamp these. They had to check every single one to see whether they met the proper legal requirements under SimDemocracy's Voter Registration Act. But did that matter? The story was salacious. It was what people wanted to hear. As one commenter put it, "Damn, is this a sign of corruption or maybe laziness? Corruption sounds scarier, so I will choose that." MBH responded, "They keep denying any responsibility. It's insane." On the 3rd of January 2025, a coalition of new political parties issued a statement titled Proclamation of Unity, Stability and Progress. We, the representatives of the Centre, the Libertarian Communist Federation, the New People's Party and the United Server Party, united by our shared vision of SimDemocracy, hereby proclaim the formation of a coalition for the 132nd senatorial term. Together, we stand as a united front, challenging the entrenched establishment and offering a bold alternative to the status quo. This coalition is more than a partnership. It is a declaration of intent to break the hold of established powers that have too long dominated the political landscape. This coalition stands united not only in purpose but in action, serving as a rallying cry for those who believe that SimDemocracy deserves better transparency, better representation, and better governance. We call on all citizens to rise with us, reject the stagnation of the establishment, and embrace a coalition that represents the true spirit of democracy. It was now official. The newcomers of the server were going to unite under one banner. Whether they were a senator or secretary, whether they were there for 6 years or 6 weeks, it didn't matter. The old guard and the establishment, they had to go. The 1st of January 2025, 1606. President Intelligent Donut sounded the alarm. Mithros had rejoined SimDemocracy. Intelligent Donut was part of a task force called Operation Spirit, a group that was set up in early December 2024 to investigate allegations of a conspiracy to overthrow SimDemocracy's government. In leaked screenshots procured by the task force, several members of the now defunct Civil Liberties Party, including a sitting senator, were pictured together discussing an apparent plan to take over the server. Their alleged plan was very simple. They'd flood SimDemocracy with alt accounts to get themselves elected, they'd unban themselves and their allies once in power, they'd stack the courts with friendly judges that looked the other way, and they'd impeach the admins to take control of the Discord server and subreddit. The 3 defendants, who were eventually charged with treason, strenuously denied the charges. Their defense was that the screenshots taken were presented wildly out of context, a pastiche of different conversations in different group chats that were intentionally stitched together to make them look as guilty as possible. They alleged that the prosecutions were politically motivated, an opportunistic attempt by the liberal establishment to eliminate their libertarian opponents, a final middle finger just before they handed the keys of power over to the wave that was about to hit SimDemocracy's shores. Mithros didn't come alone. As the day progressed, more and more players began to join SimDemocracy's Discord server. With voter registration applications accelerating by the hour, it quickly became clear that the wave had arrived. So how do you deal with a wave like this? SimDemocracy was by no means the first community to face something like this. The players of the Minecraft server 2b2t, for instance, banded together in coalitions known as incursions when they felt threatened by waves of newcomers joining their server. What did these incursions do? Well, let's take a look at one example.
So that's when a stroke of genius came from the incursion. For the first time ever in 2b2t history, slave labor.
Yeah, so, unlike 2b2t, SimDemocracy had what was known as a constitution with a Bill of Rights. One of these rights was a prohibition of slavery and forced labour. So, had the old players of SimDemocracy banded together to start such a scheme, they would have had a 100% chance of being bludgeoned to death by a group of angry Supreme Court judges for doing something so unconstitutional. But perhaps SimDemocracy could take those lessons in a different way. After all, it wasn't the only place that was facing a wave of new players. Maybe they could learn from 2b2t and band together internationally to respond to the wave. Officials from SimDemocracy, the Voices of Democracy, and Democracycraft hurriedly met together to discuss the question of the wave. SimDemocracy's negotiators were frank and to the point. They were unprepared to take in hundreds and hundreds of new players. President Intelligent Donut gave a rough estimate. They could only take in around 100 new players before the subreddit risked turning into something completely unrecognisable. Sophia, the foreign minister of the Voices of Democracy, echoed similar sentiments. In a group of hundreds, bad apples are bound to come, and those bad apples can rot our servers. The plan the two governments came up with was this. They'd post a link to Democracycraft at their border checkpoints. The idea was that when a new player attempted to join SimDemocracy or the Voices of Democracy, they'd effectively be shown an ad to Democracycraft, hopefully encouraging some of them to move to Democracycraft instead. Democracycraft, with the apparent capacity to welcome a much larger influx of players, would benefit from getting more players, and the other two would benefit from not being drowned by that very same wave. The text of the treaty was finalised at 1327 on the 1st of January 2025. 9 hours later, Democracycraft servers would begin to crash. Democracycraft was at capacity. They were in no position to sign the treaty. With international aid failing to materialise, SimDemocracy found itself all alone. It was going to have to deal with the wave all by itself. Luckily, its government still had one more trick up its sleeve: immigration law. Virtual democracies have had a long and storied tradition of depriving new players of basic constitutional rights on the grounds they lacked citizenship or some other legal status. The rationale given for these immigration laws was often the same. As virtual democracies allowed voters to make seismic changes within a community, they were particularly susceptible to brigading, which is when a large group of players from the outside descend into a community with the explicit intention of manipulating its affairs. By restricting certain political rights, such as the right to vote, the right to free speech, and the right to peaceful assembly, immigration law could be used as a speed bump or barrier to stop external brigading. Immigration law, however, was a double-edged sword. While adding more requirements to attaining citizenship made brigading more difficult, it also made the legitimate joining of new users harder, potentially stymieing a community's much-needed growth. This need to strike a balance somewhere has led immigration policy to become a hot-button political issue in some circles. Perhaps nowhere was this more evident than in the former parliamentary democracy of WolvHaven, which in the mid-2010s was seemingly gripped by a moral panic of having foreigners from other Minecraft servers joining it, running for office and voting in its elections. Anger towards newcomers reached a fever pitch when in late December 2016, a rival Minecraft server, Minecart Rapid Transit, MRT, went down for maintenance, bringing a new wave of players to WolvHaven's shores. These new players allegedly caused a massive nuisance. They reportedly built structures on the server, only to leave them abandoned later. They supposedly antagonised older players for really petty grievances, and they supposedly tried to police the speech of others on the server, a server that traditionally prided itself as having expansive protections for freedom of speech. Rumours soon circulated that the leader of the centre-left opposition party, the Honest and Green Party, was quote-unquote busing immigrants from the MRT server to WolvHaven just so they could vote for them in the next general election. One user, Rom5419, became so radicalised by the wave, he founded a self-described far-right populist organisation, the Pure Haven Party, which he later renamed the National Front. On the campaign trail, he railed against immigrants, accusing them of causing a food crisis on the server, of undermining WolvHaven's national security, and of being nothing more than a bunch of criminals, griefers, and terrorists. Elected on a promise to reform WolvHaven's immigration system, Rom tabled his flagship bill, the Permanent Residency Bill, to the House of Representatives on the 16th of December 2017. There were people on the server who were taking their citizenship for granted, he contended. They were coming here, applying for full citizenship, leaving, and then failed to come back. This bill would provide an additional layer of security to protect against new players of malicious intent and maintain the culture and demographics of the server community, while providing more opportunities for players deemed illegitimate for citizenship to experience the server's features. The bill was radical in every conceivable way. Whereas in the past, players were able to attain citizenship by passing a manual background check and citizenship exam, now they would only attain permanent residency. Permanent residents would, broadly speaking, be equal to citizens, save for a couple of exceptions, namely that they couldn't own public housing, couldn't vote in server elections, couldn't form or join political parties, couldn't become architects, couldn't receive donor rank privileges even if they paid for them, couldn't build on certain parts of the server, was subject to additional taxation, and was subject to harsher punishments if they broke any criminal rules. To become a citizen, a permanent resident would have to jump through a few additional hurdles. Firstly, they'd have to be a permanent resident for at least a week, subject to behavioural monitoring reports from their peers. Secondly, they'd have to go through another, less intensive round of manual background checks. Thirdly, they'd have to have a spotless criminal record with no bans or active warnings within the past 3 months. Fourthly, they'd have to possess no permanently disqualifying characteristics, namely never being subject to a permanent ban and not being an active member of a rival server or cybercrime organisation blacklisted for acts of terrorism against WolvHaven. Fifthly, they'd have to submit to immigration authorities a self-introduction document written in either essay or point form, stating their identity details, including the usernames of main and alt accounts on Minecraft and Discord, their rationale for joining the server, and what they could contribute to the server in a language readable by at least one other member of staff. And finally, they'd have to submit their application in a month where the citizenship quota hadn't been exceeded yet, or else their application would be thrown straight into the bin. Once someone attained citizenship, they weren't in the clear, because the bill also proposed several new mechanisms to take it away. Clause 4b required that sections be stripped of their citizenship if they had 1 unappealable permanent ban, 2 appealable permanent bans, 4 temporary bans due to warnings, 8 imprisonment periods, or a conviction of treason, such as espionage on behalf of foreign entities. And, as one big FU, tucked away in a clause boringly titled as implementation, was a provision that stated that if the bill was ever repealed without an equivalent replacement, it was going to go full-on scorched earth and demote every single permanent resident into a tourist, stripping them of their rights to own property in the city, speak in the WolvHaven Discord server, use Metro cards, access vast parts of the Minecraft server, or be employed by any business. Unsurprisingly, the bill was divisive. One MP questioned whether it was a good idea to make an already complex immigration system even more complicated. Honest and Green Party leader Autobus made an impassioned plea to the House, urging them to vote against the bill. If passed, the Permanent Residency Bill would bring about an act of national self-destruction based on claims that have no basis in reality. The Prime Minister talked of filtering out troublemakers and keeping the peace. National Front MP Rom talked of terror safeguards, applicants with malicious intent, and unintegrated foreigners meddling in WolvHaven affairs. Where was the evidence for all of their claims? But others voiced objections of a different kind. The bill didn't go far enough. Why does the bill not demote inactive citizens to permanent residents? Asked one backbench MP. Inactive citizens, removed from the ever-dynamic WolvHaven community, should not be given the right to vote, lest we risk allowing a sudden influx of long-distant members flooding in and voting. With an opposition hell-bent on killing the bill, the proposal landed in legislative purgatory as MPs debated it again and again and again. And again 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 and again. By the 14th of December 2019, 2 years after the bill was first proposed, the government, who by now was a very different government to the one back in 2017, gave up entirely and passed the Permanent Residency Referendum Act. It was going to ask the people whether they wanted the bill or not. And this wasn't going to be a simple yes or no referendum. The government was going to abdicate virtually all responsibility for the bill by letting voters pick and choose which aspects of the bill they wanted and which they didn't. In January 2020, the legally non-binding referendum on the Permanent Residency Bill was held, and after 78 ballots were cast, the voters said yes, but a significantly watered-down version of it. In February 2020, the government rammed through the Permanent Residency Implementation Act, implementing the referendum results in full. On the 19th of that month, the Permanent Residency Act finally became law. 4 months later, the Deputy Prime Minister rose to speak on the floor of the House of Representatives. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the moment, current procedures for background checks allow any player with serious offences to be granted the rank of permanent resident, so long as these offences have been declared. However, even though an offence has been declared, that doesn't make it any less of a threat. Thus, this bill, the Strengthening Our Border Bill 2020, will allow for the rejection of applicants who have a prior record of offences such as hacking and griefing, even if they have been declared. Opposition MPs were apoplectic. This was another barrier to entry for new players, another way to damage the server, commented one MP. It would introduce the perverse incentive for players to lie during immigration interviews, argued another. If one player, unintentionally griefed one block and got one warning issued 5 months before, this bill could deny them permanent residency for that offence, observed another. That was disproportionate. The opposition rallied against the bill. They were going to force a vote on the proposal. The Speaker declared a division. On the question of whether the Strengthening Our Border Bill 2020 would pass second reading. The ayes to the right, 11. The noes to the left, 4. The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Unlock. The bill moved to the Senate, and they killed it immediately without a vote. WolvHaven had something that SimDemocracy didn't. Time. Legislators in WolvHaven had virtually all of the time in the world to slowly debate and discharge into committee for further debate. Senators in SimDemocracy had just 48 hours prior notice. Whatever immigration laws SimDemocracy had up until that point, those were the laws that were going to be used. And under its 2024 Voter Registration Act, a law written during a very different time, any player that had either a Discord account that was 3 months old, a Reddit account that was 3 months old, or otherwise had evidence to prove they weren't someone else's old account was eligible by law to become a registered voter. In other words, that practically encompassed everyone. With no real tools at their disposal to stop the massive wave of players from joining the server, the old players of SimDemocracy did the only thing they could. They welcomed the newcomers with open arms. The so-called old guard may have been outnumbered, but they weren't stupid. They could sense that revolution was in the air. Whether they wanted it or not, the wave was going to bring about the greatest political change the server had ever seen. The only question was whether they wanted to be part of it. And so, members of the old guard, both in government and in opposition, began singing from the same hymn sheet. More Senate seats, more jobs for immigrants, a better economy for everyone. Open borders, bigger courts, comprehensive electoral reform. Sound foreign policy, fair domestic policy, compassionate immigration policy. We are the voice of change. Vote for us, not for them. 37 candidates stood for the next Senate election, competing for just 5 Senate seats. Over 30 people tuned in for the live election debates held on the 3rd of January 2025. For the old guard senators seeking re-election, it was going to be the political fight of their lives. On the 5th of January 2025, SimDemocracy went to the polls. 208 ballots were cast in that election. For context, in the previous Senate election, only 14 ballots were cast. To nobody's surprise, 2 members hailing from the wave would join the Senate's ranks. But along with those 2 joined every single senator who ran for re-election. Despite the seemingly overwhelming odds, the old guard managed to smash the newcomer coalition by completely co-opting all of their talking points and taking the wind out of their sails. By being so willing and eager to embrace change, or at the very least pretending to be, the old players of SimDemocracy had shown that not only was their age not a political issue, but that actually it was a political advantage. After all, if everyone agreed on the same talking points, political ideas and policies, why should voters pick the newcomers when they could pick the oldies with a proven track record? The subsequent presidential election saw the jockeying of several multi-party coalitions. With the help of a highly coordinated and disciplined campaign, socialist candidate iMade won in a landslide. As a self-professed SimDem boomer themselves, iMade ran in a joint ticket with Tripod Plays, a new waver. Their messaging was clear. They would not divide themselves based on one's generation. The new administration moved at haste, seeking to implement the laundry list of promises they made to voters. They dramatically expanded the civil service, They nationalised the casinos. They worked with the Senate to reform the economy in a pro-Labour way as God intended. But they also did something that wasn't in their manifesto. They dropped the prosecutions of the former members of the Civil Liberties Party. The defendants celebrated the decision. The prosecutors watched with dismay. They had, in their eyes, overwhelming evidence to show that these members engaged in a conspiracy to overthrow the democratic and constitutional order of SimDemocracy. With a flick of a pen, the president had allowed all of them to walk free. The Department of Voter Registration slammed the decision, calling it an incredible lack of respect for SimDemocracy's democratic institutions. The independent ombudsman launched an inquiry to investigate whether undue influence or misconduct played a part in the administration's decision. The Attorney General and New Waiver themselves strongly protested the decision behind closed doors. Dropping charges would set a terrible precedent for democracy and the rule of law. The President and the Vice President overruled him. But for all of the ruckus the decision caused, including the resignations of the Chief Justice and the Deputy Activity Secretary, the administration stuck to their guns. Because behind closed doors, they agonised over the decision. Yes, they believed the charges were politically motivated. Yes, they believed the charges lacked legal merit. But those weren't their only motivations. Because, to a certain extent, there was also a belief that the server had to move on. The prosecutions were a bitter dispute that pitted old players against old, a symbol of 5 years of anger boiling over between SimDemocracy's two political factions, the Liberals and the Libertarians. The wave had brought a new type of politics, one that broke free from traditional divides that ruled the server. Why should the new generation be saddled with the duty to heal the wounds of someone else's past? Through the ballot box, the people had spoken, and the people wanted change. Through the ballot box, the people had expressed their desire. They wanted a new beginning. As Toast watched my documentary, a thought came to his mind. This would be a cool experiment to run. As he was halfway through watching the video, he created a Discord server that would later be known as the Democratic Republic of Julia. Many players who similarly watched my video stumbled across Julia by simply typing Discord Democracy Sim on websites like Google and Discord. Julia was one of the many virtual democracies that were formed after the publication of the documentary. For these players, the players who chose to create their own democracies instead of joining a pre-existing one, many issues had to be resolved from scratch. One of their first major issues was simply, how do you even start one? Toast, being the founder of Julia and the owner of its Discord server, decided to unilaterally impose several rules to get the ball rolling. Everyone had to follow the terms of service, no one was allowed to use alt accounts, and players had to be respectful to one another. He also made provisions for how the server's first ever election would be held. Political parties could be registered if they had 3 or more members. Presidential candidates had to file their registration by the 8th of January, and presidential elections were to be held using ranked choice voting. But as quickly as Toast got the ball rolling with creating some semblance of a Discord government, concerns began to be raised about Toast's dictatorial powers. As Julia's founder, he seemingly possessed total legal power that wouldn't be relinquished until the server elected its first ever president. And it appeared that Toast wasn't exactly waiting for that to happen, as he issued a slate of new executive edicts and orders. He muted a player for making cheating allegations on the grounds it violated the no disrespect rule. He banned the use of AI, telling opponents of the policy to argue with a wall. he announced the hiring of a slew of unelected staff members, such as admins, moderators, and community assistants, to help him run the servers. Whispers that Julia was transforming into an adminocracy followed. Perhaps the largest controversy during this time was the holding of the election itself. On the 12th of January 2025, the staff team disqualified a candidate on the grounds they had bribed another player. The bribe in question involved Julia's virtual currency, something that basically had no real-world value. When the election finally took place on the 13th, an anonymous complaint was submitted, alleging that several members had joined the Discord server hours before the election, said nothing on the server, and then cast their ballots. Toast acknowledged the concern of users getting their votes trounced by people simply getting invited just to vote, but ultimately dismissed the complaint and proceeded as normal. Why did alleged bribery involving monopoly warrant action, but alleged brigading, which could have swayed the elections, didn't? Regardless, a player was elected as Julia's first president, and as one parting edict, Toast proclaims that the new president had absolute legal power. His only caveat? Once a constitution was put into place, all players, including the president, were expected to adhere to it. With that, Toast abdicated all responsibility for Julia's future and placed them in the hands of President Blight. Now, it was Blight's turn to answer tough questions, like, how do you write a constitution? Technically, with absolute power, Blight could have just written the entire thing himself and passed it without debate. Indeed, his party, the United Workers' Party, already had a draft in the works which proposed to implement a presidential form of government. Blight could have gone further and chosen not to pass a constitution at all. After all, his absolute powers were only extinguished once a constitution was put in place. So, if he didn't put one in place, he could have remained president for life. But just because someone has the legal power to do something doesn't necessarily mean they have the political capital to do it. Julia was still in its infancy. The server had been barely up for 2 weeks. Its players hadn't invested that much time and effort into the experiment. If Blight did something that players found deeply objectionable, they could simply break away from Julia and create their own Discord democracies. For the constitution to truly work, it needed to have legitimacy. It needed to have buy-in from the various political factions of Julia, each with their own wants and needs for the server to remain intact. To that end, Blight created the Constitutional Advisory Board, the CAB, a board of representatives hailing from every party of Julia. They were going to draft a grand compromise, a constitution that would truly reflect the democratic aspirations of the Julian people. With that lofty goal in mind, the CAB went about its mission to unify the server. With pen and paper in hand, the CAB cordially worked out their differences to draft a constitution that would bring together— I'm just kidding, the board nearly collapsed the moment it was founded. Jash, a representative from the People's Assembly, was outraged. They entered into a coalition with Blight's party with the understanding that they and their fellow partners, the Independents for a Secure Democracy, got to have a say over how the constitution was drafted. Why on earth were they being made to share power with opposition parties that lost the election? Blight quickly made an appeal to his coalition partners. The political opposition was still a sizable minority within Julia. If the constitution was to be the server's unifying document, they had to give their opponents at least a token say in the drafting process. Making amends, Blight gave some informal assurances to his coalition partners. He would allow them to voice their priorities separately, outside of formal CAB meetings. Cooler heads eventually prevailed. With the question of who would draft the constitution sorted, the CAB now had to answer the question of what would actually be in it. Was Julia going to have a president, a congress, a supreme court? Was it going to have a prime minister, a parliament, a supreme court? Perhaps it could have a Bundeskanzlerin, Bundestag, Bundesverfassungsgericht. Or perhaps even a 总统. Was Julia going to have a Bill of Rights? If so, what kind of rights should be included? To what extent should those rights be protected? Should the government be able to override those rights in the event of a national emergency? How would government officials be elected? What electoral system would be used? Even if you don't care about voting systems, past experience tells us there will be someone who absolutely will, and you'll be implementing the D'Hondt method of party list proportional representation instead of the Droop quota single transferable vote, no, full preferential instant runoff vote, no, threshold equal approval, over their dead fucking bodies. Time wasn't on Cab's side. As Jash, one of the members, put it, to some younger players, a month felt like years. Every day, the board spent debating amongst themselves about what things to include or exclude in the constitution was a day that Blight remained Julia's indefinite serving president. Every day, the board struggled with logistical issues such as arranging meetings when everyone's time zones were different, brought criticisms that the board was intentionally wasting time. Every day that Blight remained president, both his and the cab's political legitimacy weakened as the server's players became increasingly restless and agitated. But in the end, they did it. They produced a final constitution. On the 31st of January 2025, the Constitution of Julia was ratified, having received 75% of the vote in a ratification referendum. But all of that was just the beginning. Now, they actually had to make the constitution work. The decisions and compromises the cab made in those fateful weeks would shape the contours of Julia's future. That much was foreseeable. What was perhaps less foreseeable was that the impacts of those choices would go much further than just Julia's own borders. To all those who see this message, Imperial American began. The legislation being talked about in Julia regarding its ability to enforce its laws abroad is an act of encroachment in the independence of sovereign nations. No nation should be allowed to enforce its laws within nations that do not regard it as law. This act from Julia shows that Julia is a nation of aggression and that it doesn't care for the sovereignty of other nations, nor does it care for the independence of other nations, and I, for one, will not stand for it. These attempts at annexation will not be left unchecked by the Republic of Mardonia. Imperial American was the alleged foreign minister of the self-styled Republic of Mardonia, a self-governing Discord server similar in some respects to Julia. The legislation they were referring to was actually just a proposal called Petition 81, a citizen-led initiative that proposed extending Julian law to so-called Julia-adjacent servers, which are defined as any server in which a link to it is sent inside of Julia. Imperial American had reason to be concerned. 2 months before, Julia's citizens passed a law known as Referendum 15, unilaterally annexing the Mardonian server as a Julian region. The referendum law claimed to extinguish its independence as a state, mandating that Julian officials only recognise the Mardonian server insofar as it was a semi-autonomous region without a right to conduct its own foreign relations. The law demanded unification at all costs. Every Mardonian citizen would be forced to choose between us or them, and be banned if they choose Mardonia until they submit. Ultimatums will be sent to Mardonia to submit or to face consequences. Those consequences? War. One way or another, the long-lost child would return home. Mardonia's putative authorities strongly protested against the passage of Referendum 15. The region was a sovereign, independent state, they insisted, one without any historical or legal ties to Julia. Not only was Julia's annexation a flagrant violation of international law, it was completely unenforceable. The Julian government had no control over their Discord server with which they could effect its annexation. This wasn't even the first time that Julia attempted to annex the disputed region. In late February 2025, Julian Mardonian dual citizens submitted an initiative inside the Mardonian server to annex itself into Julia. While a local Mardonian court quickly struck down the initiative as being unconstitutional, the president of the mainland angrily condemned the local authorities for refusing to pass it into a referendum vote, slapping a series of sanctions against them in protest. A few weeks later, citizens within Julia managed to get an initiative on the ballot, Referendum 4, which proposed annexing the contested region as the Mardonian municipality. While Referendum 4 was eventually voted down, it acted as the precursor to Referendum 15, which passed with a majority vote. Julia's repeated attempts to annex the Mardonian server had put local officials in a tailspin, who had begun to fear the worst. The region was not prepared for a full-blown war against its much larger neighbour. A Discord state multiple times its size, Julia had rapidly grown to be a global power among the broader Discord government community, cultivating what some called the Juliasphere, where it exercised both diplomatic and military influence. With its player base seemingly united by a strong sense of nationalism, Julia had the capacity to focus its attention not only on domestic affairs, but domestic affairs as well. In contrast, the Mardonian region was a server that was barely holding itself together, beset by a long history of bitter infighting, internal division, and civil strife. Hell, the server almost had a Library of Alexandria moment when its Chief Justice went rogue and deleted what was thought to be the only copy of the Renegade Republic's constitution. Founded as a loveless marriage between two independent states, the Mardonian region's creation arguably confounded all expectations. Its two former states, Havia and Collier, were founded at different times, under different circumstances, with different people. The two had next to nothing in common with each other and only agreed to form a union on the basis that both needed more members. A minority of players from both Havia and Collier strongly disagreed with the creation of the so-called Mardonian Republic, and its officials were all too aware of it. In particular, some within the region were worried that the server was susceptible to divide and rule, a tactic where foreign or domestic powers would exacerbate divisions between the Colliers and the Havians in an attempt to split Mardonia into two. Attempts were made to suppress these intermittent nationalist agitations, but suppression could only do so much. It couldn't kill their ideas. The Julian mainland, Mardonian leaders feared, had already made its move. It had flooded the region with its citizens, signing them up for so-called Mardonian citizenship to vote in its elections and run for their offices, their true loyalties only betrayed by their failed attempt to Anschluss the region from within. It had embarked on a massive information war, carpet bombing its airwaves and public squares with propaganda denying the existence of Mardonian statehood, making appeals for the children of the Mardonian region to return back home, to return to their motherland, the Democratic Republic of Julia. Mainland officials had seemingly riled up its populace for total war, its defense minister openly calling for the genocide of Mardonians, vowing not to rest until each and every mention of Mardonia is wiped off clean from the books of history. The Mardonian people weren't going to take these threats lying down, so they fought back in a way they knew best, by making an appeal to the League of Servers, a United Nations-style body of Discord states. Julia's actions were a clear violation of the League's charter, they said, a blatant breach of Article 8, which forbade the threatening of other servers, the waging of war, and the taking of offensive actions of any sort. The international community must condemn Julia's aggressive actions against their local server. But Julian representatives were there to shoot down those pleas at every turn. It was perhaps regrettable that Julia's citizens felt the need to pass Referendum 15, but the Julian state would like to remind its international partners that it did not support its passage. Under Julian's constitution, citizens had the right to directly pass legislation, and in this case, those citizens chose to reaffirm Julia's sovereignty over the Mardonian semi-autonomous region. The government of Julia had regrettably lost control of its domestic policy to an angry mob. It was out of its hands. But let's be clear. This was all the Mardonian regime's own doing. It had abandoned the rule of law and chosen to elect a fascist. Its chancellor was a racist, defender of the Confederate flag, user of racial slurs, and believer in eugenics. Its government had banned countless members of Julian Mardonian citizens without charge or trial, and had instigated a vicious campaign against immigrants and refugees. Its pathetic, short-lived republic sided with the leaders of the Aulia coup over peaceful pro-democracy protesters, defaming their fight for freedom as being Julian-led raids in this venue and others. Could Julia's citizens really be blamed for being angry under those circumstances? Could Julia really be at fault for wishing to terminate what was less a state and more a terrorist organisation? Was the League seriously going to defend a server that, by its own admission, was a land of second chances that people don't deserve, a prison colony of the worst of other servers, a second stop for exiled politicians, war criminals, and felons from Julia? The diplomats of the Mardonian regime sunk back to their seats, the plight of their server falling on deaf ears. The annexation of its server wouldn't even warrant a minor hearing inside one of the League's many assembly committees. For the Mardonian people, the international community had turned its back on them. It was going to have to fight its fight all alone. As news of Petition 81 spread across the server, the repressed feelings of the Mardonian people began to surface. Anger. Not less than an hour after Imperial American's fiery speech, another headline hit the server. "You're our colony," Julia responds. Following the Mardonian response to Julia's Petition 81, allowing Julia to conduct and enforce Julian law in non-Julian territory, former President of Julia Toast had quite a bit to say in a short amount of time. Mardonia can fuck off. They're good-for-nothing Julian rejects. I have the freedom to say Mardonians are literally the bottom of the barrel. It's not a crisis. Mardonia is our colony. Here's it clear and concise. Mardonia doesn't exist. The Mardonian people had not forgotten the many attempts Julia made to annex it. The Mardonian people had not forgotten the international isolation it received as Julia threw its diplomatic weight around. The Mardonian people had not forgotten the coup of April 2025, when its then president Katiak took over the server and proclaimed himself king, banning scores of political opponents protesting his regime. Their deeply held suspicions were seemingly confirmed by news reports reportedly exposing the Julian state's complicity in the overthrowing of their government, with its coup leader being paid $30,000 Julian in bribes. And how did the Julian government react to this report? With dismissiveness. The coup was not that serious, not that big of a deal. The funder of the coup would be given presidential protection. The Mardonian people were sick and tired of having their server be treated as nothing more than Julia's doormat, a plaything for the Julian state to make and break at will. But this time was different. Unlike so many of its run-ins with the Julian state, this time its actions garnered international attention. Because Petition 81 didn't just affect the Mardonian region, it threatened to affect every Discord government that Julia encountered with, and the others took note. Aulia's vice president called for an international response to unite against Julian imperialism. The leader of one of its major parties called for a radical realignment of Aulian foreign policy to break free from the imperialism, corruption, and toxicity of the neo-colonial Juliosphere. The Parliament of Huria unanimously passed the Anti-Julia Act, a law that blacklisted Julia's founder Toast from joining their server, and a law that imposed several new sanctions in the event of Petition 81's passage. For the Mardonian nationalists, it felt like a dream come true. Julia had finally overplayed its hands, and now its officials were on full-on damage control. The government distanced itself from the petition, emphasising that it was a citizen-led initiative that didn't reflect government policy. The Minister of the Registrar resigned in protest, condemning Toast's anti-Mardonian remarks and calling for his impeachment as Julia's owner. The Chief Justice made an unprecedented intervention, stating in their opinion that the petition was unconstitutional and would likely be struck down by the mainland Supreme Court. But all of this was too little, too late. The people of the Juliosphere had finally woken up to the reality of Julian oppression, and now its tributary states were rising up in open rebellion. Julia's highly aggressive actions, which the Mardonian people had spent months trying to shed light on, were finally getting the international attention it deserved. And then the momentum stopped. The Mardonian Chancellor U-turned on their government's comments, urging for calm and a restoration of Mardonian-Julian relations. Huria's president issued a press release declaring that Julia and the proud Julian people are not our enemies, promising to hold emergency talks with Julian officials to resolve this incident. The Hurrian president, as it turned out, was in contact with the journalists who extensively covered the Petition 81 crisis, and in their second press release leaked a damning screenshot from one of their conversations. The Julian crisis was intentionally amplified, the journalist was pictured saying. I needed to stress test all the diplomatic relations so they'd become stronger temporarily to open the door for global peace. My plan was to provoke the impeachment of Julia's owner, Toast, which would reduce Julia's power in the inter-server union and make me one of the most influential figures in the ISU. Petition 81, as it turned out, was a nothing burger. A legislative proposal hijacked by a rogue journalist to intentionally destabilise Julia's relations with governments, both foreign and domestic. No Discord nation or semi-autonomous region could credibly use the crisis to condemn Julia's actions on the world stage. Once again, the plight of the Mardonian people disappeared into obscurity. Things only went downhill from there. On the 28th of June 2025, the server suffered yet another coup, one perpetrated by their president, Notcom. Notcom, fearing she may potentially lose her re-election, activated her plans to coup the Mardonian government that were months in the making. She unilaterally declared the establishment of the Mardonian Communist Republic, rapidly banned several members of the political opposition, and gave admin permissions to her co-conspirators, who proceeded to delete several channels of the Mardonian Discord server in an act many described as a nuking. The reconstituted authorities of the failed municipality quickly pointed fingers at the states they held responsible. SimDemocracy's government, it alleged, had a very high involvement in the coup, providing support, planning, and members for the operation. Julia and the Voices of Democracy were complicit, with several of their members providing the junta aid and comfort. With righteous anger, the Mardonian authorities sought to exact their revenge. They would make SimDemocracy pay for their crimes by appealing to the League of Servers. SimDemocracy had blatantly violated the League's charter, they alleged. The subreddit had launched an audacious attack against the server, contrary to Article 8's prohibition against member state aggression, and had given refuge to the members of the junta who are now fashioning themselves as the Mardonian government in exile. The international community must condemn SimDemocracy's aggressive actions against the region of Mardonia. The representatives of SimDemocracy spoke in turn. It was, perhaps, regrettable that some of its citizens took matters into their own hands and decided to nuke the Mardonian server into smithereens, and the state of SimDemocracy would like to give the people of that server its thoughts and prayers in this difficult time. The state of SimDemocracy would like to give its assurances that it was not involved in the coup, and SimDemocracy was obviously more than willing to support the League in its reconstruction of the failed quasi-state. But let's take this outside of the League's venues for a moment, shall we? Between you and me, we all know that this was the Mardonian regime's own doing. It had harboured racists, fascists, homophobes and transphobes. Its people engaged in campaigns of harassment against its dual citizen population. Doctored screenshots, open bigotry, occasional death threats. What exactly wasn't the self-styled republic doing to other people? Could SimDemocracy's citizens really be blamed for being outraged under those circumstances? Could SimDemocracy really be culpable for the actions taken by a rogue group of players hailing from all of your states as well? Was the League seriously going to suspend a global SimGov superpower owing to a tenuous, unproven allegation that it was somehow responsible for this attack, which it has already publicly condemned? The diplomats of the disgraced server left with empty hands, its coup not even warranting a minor World Assembly resolution condemning it. The minuscule concession it won with Notcom's addition on the Interpol watchlist was unceremoniously snatched away once it was overturned on appeal. To add insult to injury, a month after the coup, SimDemocracy would be reappointed as a semi-permanent member of the League's Security Council, tasked with, among other things, enforcing the Charter's prohibition of aggression against member states. The bells tolled for the server on the 16th of August 2025, the killing blow struck by its newly elected president, Moose, who declared the formation of the Provisional Government of Havia. He proclaimed that his executive orders were the highest authority of the land, and he had begun to dismantle the putative Mardonian Republic's constitution. His actions were in response to the secession of Collier, which had declared its independence from the server following his election as a Havian nationalist. Throughout the server's chaotic and tumultuous months, bubbles of tension had begun to surface between the region's two ethnicities, the Kralians and the Havians. Their cultural differences had become too much to bear. The Kralians accused the Havians of cultural genocide. The Havians accused the Kralians of much the same. Mardonian unionists, who had spent so much time and effort to unite the two, found their dreams shattered by irreconcilable ethnic tensions. In the end, their divorce was mutual. They would go about their separate ways. Havia would be an independent state, Collier would be an independent state. Neither would get in each other's way. So, as the Havians and the Kralians looked to a brighter future, news from a foreign land reached their separated shores. Prosecutors from the neighbouring state of Aulia had pressed charges against 3 Aulian citizens for treason against Aulia and the former state of Mardonia. Prosecutors alleged that the defendants engaged in a conspiracy to coup the Mardonian government with the intention of annexing them into Aulia. Their alleged plans were very simple. they'd fuel the flames of nationalist agitation inside the server. By providing aid and comfort to Havian nationalists who were competing in the server's elections, they'd be able to split the two ethnic groups apart, leading to the disintegration of the Mardonian Union. Once Havia and Collier became two independent states again, they'd be small enough to be swooped upon by a larger Aulia to be forcibly integrated as sovereign and indivisible Aulian lands. The divide had now been completed. All that was left was the rule. As I was planning the script for my documentary on virtual democracies, I made the fateful decision to highlight SimDemocracy as my first featured case study. I highlighted SimDemocracy not because it was special, but because it was precisely the opposite. The founding legend its players passed down of how the subreddit overthrew its tyrannical founder wasn't special. Not least because the magic of the story really dies down when you realise the founder they overthrew was actually a 13-year-old kid, but also because others had similar stories as well. Its constitution wasn't special, its legal system wasn't special, its political theory wasn't special. SimDemocracy was one of a million stories of democracy experiments set up by people from all around the world. The irony then was that by making my video, I made SimDemocracy special for some of my viewers, because for them, it was their first foray into the wild world of virtual democracies. But it wasn't just SimDemocracy, of course. As previously mentioned, my viewers created and landed in many other places, each with their own partially semi-unique stories to tell. But to prevent this video from being 8 hours long, those stories would have to be covered in another time.